My beloved child. Stop for a moment, not because fear is chasing you, but because there are moments in life that seem too strange to ignore. Some stories arrive like whispers carried by the wind, finding only those whose hearts are ready to listen. Perhaps this is one of those stories. Perhaps it found you for a reason that cannot yet be explained. No one in that crowded store expected the silence to arrive before the tears. People were moving from aisle to aisle with shopping carts full of ordinary plans. Bright lights reflected from polished floors. Children laughed. Cash registers sang their endless rhythm. Everything looked painfully normal. Until one heart could no longer pretend. Far across the room, someone suddenly stopped walking. They stood perfectly still as though time itself had reached out and touched their shoulder. No one knew what memory had found them. No one understood why their breathing became uneven. No one realized that a single invisible thread connected that moment, to someone who was not even there. To you. But understand something before this story goes any further. This is not a story about blame. It is not a story about punishment. It is not even a story about loss. It is a story about what happens when emotions buried beneath years of silence suddenly refuse to remain hidden. There are moments when the human soul grows tired of carrying unfinished conversations. There are moments when memories become louder than the voices surrounding us. There are moments when love, whether spoken or unspoken, asks to be acknowledged. This story begins in one of those moments. Imagine standing beneath harsh white lights while hundreds of strangers move around you without ever noticing the invisible battle taking place inside your heart. Imagine reaching for an ordinary object, and instead touching a memory you thought had disappeared forever. That is exactly how it began. No warning. No preparation. Only one unexpected reminder. No one nearby understood why their hand began to tremble. No one knew why they placed the item back onto the shelf as though it had suddenly become too heavy to hold. No one could hear the conversation taking place inside their heart. Because the loudest conversations are often completely silent. If you have ever wondered whether certain connections leave traces long after distance separates two people, this story invites you to consider that possibility, not as certainty, but as a reflection of how deeply human emotions can linger. The crowd continued moving. Announcements echoed overhead. Someone laughed nearby. A shopping cart rolled past. Life refused to pause. Yet inside one person, everything had already changed. There are moments when the outside world keeps moving while the inside world comes to a complete stop. This was one of them. They tried to smile. It lasted only a second. They tried to breathe normally. Their heart refused. They whispered something so quietly that even the person standing beside them could not understand. Only one name rested inside those words. Only one memory stood behind the tears. Only one face continued returning no matter how desperately they tried to think about something else. Whether that face truly belonged to you is part of the mystery this story will continue to explore. Because sometimes our imagination, our hopes, our regrets, and our deepest feelings weave together in ways that feel almost miraculous. Sometimes we spend years convincing ourselves we have moved on, only to discover that healing is not the same thing as forgetting. The strongest people often become experts at hiding their emotions. Until one ordinary afternoon refuses to stay ordinary. Until one familiar song, one familiar scent, one familiar color, Or one familiar memory quietly unlocks a door they believed had been sealed forever. No one plans for that moment. No one schedules heartbreak. No one expects an ordinary day to become unforgettable. Yet countless lives change exactly that way. The people nearby noticed something was wrong. One person asked if they were feeling unwell. Another offered water. Someone suggested sitting down. No one knew the real battle had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. The storm was taking place somewhere no one else could see. Inside the quiet places of memory. Inside unanswered questions. Inside words that had never been spoken aloud. And somewhere beyond those unanswered questions, there waited a truth that even they had not fully admitted to themselves. That truth has not yet been revealed. Not because it is hidden by heaven, but because every heart reveals its deepest truths only when it is finally ready. Perhaps that moment is closer than anyone realizes. And perhaps what happened next would change everything they believed about love, forgiveness, and the courage to face what had been left unfinished. The silence lasted only a few seconds, yet it felt as though an entire lifetime had unfolded within it. Those standing nearby believed they had witnessed nothing more than someone becoming overwhelmed. But there are moments in every person's journey when the visible event is only the surface of something far deeper. Whether through memory, longing, regret, or hope, the heart sometimes chooses an unexpected place to reveal what it has hidden for far too long. They slowly lowered themselves onto a nearby bench, trying to steady their breathing while the sounds of the store continued as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Shopping carts rolled by. Conversations blended into the background. Children laughed somewhere in the distance. The ordinary world continued without interruption, yet inside them every familiar certainty had begun to crumble. A single question echoed again and again. What if I waited too long? That question refused to disappear. It returned with every heartbeat. It followed every breath. No one around them could hear it, but it had become louder than every announcement coming from the speakers overhead. Sometimes the greatest struggle is not between two people. Sometimes it is between the person we are today and the truth we have avoided admitting to ourselves. For so long they had convinced themselves that moving forward meant refusing to look back. They filled empty hours with responsibilities, conversations, and distractions. They smiled when expected. They laughed when everyone else laughed. They assured themselves that everything was finally under control. Yet deep inside, one unfinished chapter remained quietly open. Life has a mysterious way of reminding us that ignored emotions rarely disappear. They simply wait patiently beneath the surface until something unexpectedly invites them back into the light. That invitation arrived in the simplest way imaginable. A familiar melody drifted softly through the store. It wasn't remarkable to anyone else. Most shoppers barely noticed it. But to them, the melody unlocked a memory so vivid that it almost felt alive. Suddenly they remembered a quiet evening filled with gentle conversation, shared dreams, and promises that once seemed impossible to break. Every small detail returned with astonishing clarity. The way the sunlight had faded into evening. The warmth of a smile that once brought peace. The hope that tomorrow would always belong to both of them. Memories often return without asking permission. They do not knock before entering. They simply appear. And once they do, pretending they were never important becomes almost impossible. Their eyes filled with tears they had promised themselves would never return. Not because they believed the past could be relived, but because they finally understood how much of their own heart had remained there. Across the store, strangers continued comparing prices, searching shelves, and discussing weekend plans. None of them realized they were standing only a few steps away from someone quietly confronting years of hidden emotion. Sometimes the loudest turning points in life happen without applause, without witnesses, without anyone recognizing that a new beginning has quietly started. As they sat there, another realization slowly emerged. This wasn't only about missing someone. It was about finally admitting what had never been spoken honestly, not to another person, but to themselves. They had spent countless nights wondering whether certain words should have been said sooner. Whether forgiveness should have arrived before pride. Whether silence had protected them, or imprisoned them. Questions like these rarely disappear on their own. They linger. They grow. They patiently wait until courage finally catches up with them. Perhaps that is why this story has reached you today. Not to convince you that every unanswered question has an immediate answer, but to remind you that every heart deserves the chance to face its truth instead of running from it. The moment on that bench became quieter. Their breathing gradually slowed. The trembling in their hands began to ease. For the first time in a long while, they stopped fighting the emotions rising within them. Instead of pushing them away, they listened. Sometimes listening to your own heart requires more bravery than speaking before an entire crowd. Another thought quietly entered their mind. What if it isn't too late to choose honesty? The question brought both fear and hope. Fear because honesty can change everything. Hope because truth often becomes the first step toward genuine healing. No one can rewrite yesterday. No one can erase every mistake. Yet every new day quietly offers another opportunity to respond differently than before. That possibility began growing inside them like the first light before sunrise. Small. Fragile. Easy to overlook. Yet impossible to ignore once it appeared. Just then, their phone vibrated. They looked at the screen. For several long seconds they couldn't move. Their heartbeat quickened again. The notification itself wasn't dramatic, but the name attached to it carried more emotion than they had expected to feel. Their fingers hovered above the screen. Should they open it? Should they wait? Should they walk away once more? Every possibility seemed to lead toward a future they could no longer predict. And just before they made their decision, another unexpected event unfolded, one that would force them to confront the very truth they had spent so long trying to avoid. That moment would change the direction of this story in a way neither they nor anyone watching could have imagined. The screen remained illuminated in their trembling hand, yet they could not bring themselves to tap the notification. It wasn't because they feared what the message might say. It was because they feared what they might feel the moment they read it. Around them, the ordinary rhythm of the store continued. A cashier greeted another customer. A child laughed while reaching for a brightly colored toy. Somewhere nearby, a shopping cart squeaked as it rolled across the polished floor. Life carried on exactly as it always had, but for them, time seemed suspended between one heartbeat and the next. Finally, they took a slow breath and unlocked the phone. The message itself was surprisingly simple. There were no dramatic declarations. No accusations. No desperate pleas. Just a few gentle words that stirred emotions they had spent so long trying to bury. Reading them didn't answer every question. Instead, they opened 100 new ones. For a long moment, they simply stared at the screen, unable to move. Their eyes filled again, not because the words were extraordinary, but because they arrived at exactly the moment their heart had become too tired to keep pretending everything was fine. Sometimes it isn't the longest message that reaches us the deepest. Sometimes a single sentence carries the weight of years left unspoken. As they lowered the phone, they noticed their reflection in a nearby glass display. For the first time in a very long while, they didn't see someone who had everything under control. They saw someone exhausted from carrying emotions that had never truly been released. That realization was uncomfortable, yet strangely freeing. The strongest walls are often built around the softest hearts, and those walls can stand for years before a single unexpected moment reveals how fragile they really are. They closed their eyes for only a second. Memories returned once more. Not only the joyful ones. The difficult conversations. The misunderstandings. The silence that grew where honest words should have lived. They realized that every memory, whether painful or beautiful, had shaped who they were becoming. There was no changing the past. But perhaps there was still a choice about what kind of future they would create. A quiet sense of clarity slowly replaced the confusion that had overwhelmed them only minutes earlier. Healing, they began to understand, does not always arrive as a sudden miracle. Sometimes it begins with one honest decision. One sincere conversation. One step taken despite uncertainty. As they stood from the bench, their hands were steadier than before. The tears had not erased every wound, but they had washed away the illusion that ignoring those wounds would somehow make them disappear. They started walking toward the exit. Each step felt different. Not lighter because every burden had vanished, but stronger because they had finally stopped running from what their heart had been trying to tell them. Just before reaching the automatic doors, their phone vibrated once again. This time it wasn't another message. It was a call. They looked at the name appearing on the screen. Their breath caught. The world around them seemed to fade into silence once more. Their thumb hovered above the answer button. One choice stood before them. Answer, and allow the next chapter of their life to begin. Or let the phone stop ringing and wonder forever what might have happened if they had simply found the courage to say hello. The ringing continued. And with every passing second, the future waited for its answer. The ringing seemed louder than anything else in the world, though no one around them appeared to notice it. Every passing second stretched into what felt like an eternity. Their heart urged them to answer, while every fear they had carried for so long whispered that remaining silent would be easier. But some moments arrive only once. They closed their eyes, drew one steady breath, and touched the screen. For a brief instant, neither person spoke. Only the quiet sound of breathing traveled between them, carrying years of distance that words alone could never explain. Then a gentle voice finally broke the silence. "I didn't know if you would answer." There was no anger. No accusation. Only honesty. Sometimes the absence of blame is more powerful than the loudest argument. They struggled to find the right response. Countless speeches they had imagined over endless nights suddenly disappeared. Every carefully rehearsed sentence faded away, leaving only the truth. "I almost didn't." Another silence followed. Yet this one felt different. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of two hearts deciding whether they still had the courage to be completely honest. Outside, rain had begun to fall softly against the store windows. Tiny drops slid down the glass, blurring the lights beyond the parking lot. The world seemed to slow, as though even time itself was waiting to hear what would come next. "I've carried something for a long time," the voice said quietly. "Not because I wanted to hold on to pain, but because I never found the right moment to let it go." Those words settled deeply. They realized that healing is rarely about proving who was right or wrong. More often, it begins when both people stop defending themselves long enough to truly listen. For the first time in years, neither of them interrupted. Neither hurried to explain. Neither searched for someone to blame. They simply listened. That simple act began changing everything. The conversation unfolded gently, revealing forgotten hopes, misunderstood moments, and quiet regrets that had remained hidden behind pride. Every sentence lifted another invisible weight. No dramatic promises were made. No impossible guarantees were spoken. Instead, something far more meaningful appeared. Understanding. And sometimes understanding is the first bridge that allows two distant hearts to meet again. As the call continued, they walked slowly into the rain, barely noticing that their clothes were becoming damp. The cool air felt strangely refreshing, almost as if it marked the beginning of a season they had believed would never arrive. Yet even in that moment of growing peace, one question remained unanswered. Why had everything happened today? Why the crowded store? Why the sudden flood of memories? Why the unexpected message? And now this call? Life often answers those questions only after we have already taken the first courageous step. As they reached their car, another notification appeared on the phone immediately after the call ended. It wasn't from the same person. It was an old photograph that had resurfaced automatically in the phone's memories. A picture from years ago. Two genuine smiles. A moment untouched by fear. They stared at it for a long time. Not because they wished to live in the past, but because it reminded them that hope had once existed. And if hope had existed before, perhaps it could exist again in a new and wiser form. They gently placed the phone in their pocket and looked toward the cloudy sky. For the first time in what felt like forever, they didn't ask, "Why did this happen?" Instead, they quietly wondered, "What am I meant to do now?" That question would lead them toward a discovery neither of them expected, a truth waiting far beyond the rain, one that would test whether healing was merely a beautiful conversation, or the beginning of a completely different future. And that answer was closer than either of them realized.